Something very telling is unfolding around the Detroit Lions right now, and it's happening at the perfect time, because as the draft gets closer, the picture of what this front office wants to do is becoming clearer by the day. And the biggest takeaway from everything that just came out is simple. The Lions are going to have real opportunities on the offensive line, and not just average options, but legitimate impact players who could step in and make a difference immediately. Because here's what just happened. New evaluations and projections dropped, and they're pointing toward one very important reality. There are multiple high-level offensive linemen in this draft class, and not all of them are going to be gone early. That matters a lot for Detroit. It means that when the Lions are on the clock, they won't be forced into a reach. They'll have choices. And one name that keeps showing up over and over again is Spencer Fanu, a player who fits exactly what this team needs right now. And when you look at the current situation, it makes perfect sense. The Lions are still short at tackle. Right now, you're looking at a scenario where Larry Borom is in a starting role, and while he's a solid backup, that's not a spot where you feel completely comfortable heading into a season where expectations are high. That's where a player like Fanu becomes extremely interesting because he brings versatility. He can play tackle, but if needed, he can also slide inside to guard. That flexibility alone gives the coaching staff options, and on top of that, his run blocking ability stands out as something that could immediately elevate the offensive line. And that's the key word here, immediately. This is not just about depth. This is about finding someone who can step in and contribute right away, whether that means competing with guys like Christian Mahogany or potentially filling in depending on how the lineup shakes out. And speaking of Mahogany, that's another layer to this entire situation that fans should be paying attention to, because his development is going to be huge. He's one of those players that the team is quietly counting on. A late round pick who didn't have a full off season, still adjusting, still growing. If he takes that next step, suddenly the interior of this offensive line looks a lot stronger. And when you combine that with what we've been seeing from Tate Ratledge, it gets even more interesting, because after a rough start, especially that game against Green Bay that had everyone questioning everything, he settled in, he improved. And by the end of the year, the numbers and the advanced metrics were telling a very different story. He became a reliable piece, especially playing next to Penei Sewell, and that stability matters. So when you zoom out, the offensive line isn't in a bad place. In fact, it's trending in the right direction. You've got improvement internally, you've got flexibility with younger players, and now you're heading into a draft where multiple top-tier linemen are expected to still be available when Detroit picks. Names like Monroe Freeling, Caleb Lomu, and Blake Miller are all part of that conversation, and the overall takeaway is this: the Lions are not going to be boxed in. They're going to have options, and that's exactly where you want to be. But while all of that sounds great, there's another layer to this offseason that might actually matter even more, and it's something that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not the draft, it's not free agency, it's development. The growth of first and second year players is going to define how far this team can go next season, and the perfect example of that is Tyleik Williams, a first-round defensive tackle from last year who had an okay rookie season. Nothing spectacular, but he was on the field, he contributed, and now the expectation changes. Now he needs to take that jump, because last year the Lions were relying heavily on players like DJ Reader and Roy Lopez in the middle, especially with Aleem McNeil out. And while Reader was solid, he's still out there right now, and there are questions about whether bringing him back makes sense depending on the cost. But regardless of what happens with veterans, the real story is Williams. If he becomes the player the Lions believe he can be, that changes everything for the defensive front. That's the kind of internal leap that can elevate a team from good to great, and it's something you can't measure on paper the same way you measure draft grades or free agent signings. And then when you take a step back and look at the Lions' history in the first round, it tells you exactly why this moment feels different. Because over the last 20 years, it's been a mix of hits and painful misses. Recently, there's been a strong run with players like Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell, Aiden Hutchinson, Jameson Williams, and Penei Sewell, and it's no coincidence that the team is now competitive. That's what happens when you hit on your first-round picks. But before that stretch, there were too many misses. Jeff Okudah didn't work out. TJ Hawkinson was solid, but not what you expect from a top 10 pick. Eric Ebron, another example that fans don't even want to think about. And when you miss in the first round, especially multiple years in a row, it sets a franchise back. That's how you end up wondering why the team couldn't get over the hump for so long. Now, it feels like the Lions have learned from that. They're drafting better, they're developing better, and they're putting themselves in positions where they don't have to force decisions. And heading into this draft, with the offensive line talent that's expected to be available, this could be another one of those foundational moments. So now it comes down to this. If the Lions are on the clock and one of these top offensive linemen is sitting there, do you think they should lock in that pick and reinforce the trenches, or would you rather see them go in a completely different direction? And this is where the conversation really starts to get interesting, because if you follow the logic of how this front office has been operating, everything points toward building from the inside out. That's been the identity. That's been the foundation of why this team went from rebuilding to being taken seriously. So if you're sitting there on draft night and one of those top offensive linemen is still available, it almost feels like the safest and smartest move you can make. But at the same time, it's not just about playing it safe anymore. This team is no longer in a phase where they're just trying to become competitive. They already are. Now it's about maximizing the window they've created. And that's where the internal development we talked about earlier becomes the deciding factor in how aggressive they can be. Because think about it, if players like Christian Mahogany take a real step forward, if Tate Ratledge continues playing at the level he showed after settling in, and if the offensive line as a whole stabilizes, suddenly the urgency to draft a lineman early might shift. Not disappear, but shift. It gives the front office flexibility to look at other areas of the roster and ask a different question. Where can we add the most impact right now? And that's where fans might start debating things like defensive help, depth in key positions, or even playmakers depending on how the board falls. But even then, everything keeps circling back to the trenches because that's what this team has built its identity on. That's what protects your quarterback, establishes your run game, and keeps your offense consistent deep into the season. And there's another layer here that can't be ignored. The Lions are in a position now where expectations are real. This isn't a team flying under the radar anymore. Opponents are preparing for them differently. Every weakness gets exposed faster when you're a contender, so the margin for error in the draft becomes even smaller, especially in the first round. That's why looking back at those past draft classes matters so much. Not to dwell on mistakes, but to understand the difference between hitting and missing. When you land players like Penei Sewell or Aiden Hutchinson, it changes everything. Those are cornerstone pieces. But when you miss, like in previous years with certain top picks, it doesn't just hurt in the moment, it creates holes that take years to fix. Right now, it feels like the Lions are finally operating with clarity. They know what kind of players fit their system. They know the importance of physicality, versatility, and consistency. And that's exactly why someone like Spencer Fanu keeps coming up in conversations, because he checks those boxes. He fits the identity, he fits the need, and he fits the timeline. But again, this is where it gets unpredictable, because if multiple offensive linemen are available, the value might push one of them further down the board than expected. And if that happens, the Lions could be looking at a situation where they're not just getting a good player, but potentially one of the best value picks in the entire first round. At the same time, you can't ignore what's happening on the defensive side. The development of Tyleik Williams is going to be huge, but it also highlights something else. This team still needs more consistency in the middle of that defensive line. Whether that comes from within or from adding another piece, it's something that will directly impact how far this defense can go. And then there's the DJ Reader situation still lingering in the background. A player who contributed, who knows the system, and who could still have a role if the numbers make sense. Bringing him back wouldn't be a flashy move, but it would be a practical one. It would give stability while younger players continue to develop. And sometimes, those are the moves that matter the most over the course of a long season. So when you put all of this together, what you're really looking at is a team that has options, but also has pressure. The kind of pressure that comes with knowing you're close. The kind of pressure that forces every decision to matter just a little bit more. And that's why this draft feels different. It's not just about adding talent. It's about making the right choice at the right time to push this team forward without disrupting what's already working. Because if they get this right, if they hit on another first round pick and continue developing the young core the way they have been, there's no reason this team can't take another step and solidify itself as one of the top contenders. And the more you think about it, the more you realize this isn't just a single decision on draft night. It's a reflection of everything the Lions have been building toward over the last few years. Every move, every pick, every development story has led to this point where the margin between a good team and a true contender becomes incredibly thin. Because what separates those teams at the top isn't just talent, it's consistency, it's depth. It's having the ability to absorb injuries, to adjust during games, to win in different ways when your first first plan doesn't work, and that's exactly why reinforcing the offensive line still feels like the kind of move that pays off long term, even if it's not the flashiest option in the moment. At the same time, you can't ignore the confidence this front office has earned. They've shown that they can identify talent, that they can develop players, and that they understand how to build a roster that fits their identity. So if they decide to go in a different direction, it won't be random. It'll be calculated. It'll be based on how they see this team evolving, not just this season, but over the next few years. And that's the part that should excite fans the most. For the first time in a long time, it feels like there's a clear plan. Not just hope, not just potential, but a real structure behind every decision being made. Whether it's trusting young players like Tyleik Williams to take that next step, or putting the offensive line in a position to stay dominant, everything connects. So as the draft gets closer and all the speculation keeps building, just remember this: the Lions don't need to force anything. They're not desperate. They're prepared. And that alone puts them in a position that a lot of teams wish they were in right now. And execution is where everything either comes together or falls apart, because no matter how good the plan looks on paper, it only matters if the players you're counting on actually deliver when the season starts. That's why this moment feels so important for the Lions, not just because of who they might draft, but because of what they already have in the building. You start looking at the roster, and you can see the foundation is there. You can see the identity: physical up front, discipline, built to control games rather than just react to them. But to take that next leap, the difference is always in the details. It's in the second-year jump from players like Tyleik Williams. It's in whether Christian Mahogany becomes a reliable starter or remains a question mark. It's in whether the offensive line continues to be a strength or starts to show cracks against top competition. And that's why adding competition through the draft matters so much, not just for depth, but to raise the level of everyone in that room. If a rookie comes in and pushes for a starting spot, that's a good problem to have. That's how